Christmas Eve 2002. A pregnant woman vanishes from her home in Modesto, California. Her husband calls the police that evening to report her missing. But as investigators start asking questions, his story begins to fall apart. This is the story of Laci Peterson, a 27-year-old woman who was 8 months pregnant with her first child, a baby boy she and her husband had already decided to name Connor. And this is the story of how her husband, Scott Peterson, became one of the most scrutinized suspects in America. Laci Denise Rocha met Scott Peterson when they were both students. They got married in 1997, and by all outside appearances, they seemed like the perfect couple. They bought a house together on Covenant Avenue in Modesto, a middle-class neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Scott worked as a fertilizer salesman for a company in the area. Laci had been working at a restaurant called The Shack, but she stopped when she got pregnant because she wanted to focus on preparing for motherhood. Friends and family described them as happy. They seemed like the kind of couple who had it all figured out. Laci was excited about becoming a mother. She had spent months decorating the nursery in their home. She had picked out baby clothes. She had registered for baby shower gifts. She talked constantly about how much she could not wait to meet Connor. Her family said she glowed when she talked about the baby. Her due date was February 10, 2003, which meant she was just weeks away from giving birth when she disappeared. Everyone who knew Laci said she was kind, warm, and loved being around people. She was close to her family, especially her mother, Sharon Rocha. Laci was the kind of person who made friends easily and always tried to help others. But while Laci was preparing to welcome their son into the world, Scott Peterson was living a double life that nobody knew about. In November 2002, just 1 month before Laci disappeared, Scott was introduced to a woman named Amber Frey. Amber was a massage therapist who lived in Fresno, about 90 miles south of Modesto. They met on November 20th, 2002 through a mutual friend, and from the very beginning, Scott lied to her. He told Amber he was not married. This was a complete lie. At this point, Laci was 7 months pregnant and their baby was growing inside her. But Scott never mentioned Laci or the baby to Amber. Scott and Amber began a romantic relationship. They went on dates. They talked on the phone for hours. Scott was acting like a single man who had no responsibilities and no pregnant wife waiting for him at home. He told Amber stories about his life, but almost everything he said was a lie. He even told Amber that he had lost his wife and that this would be his first holiday season without her. He said this in early December 2002, weeks before Laci actually went missing. It was as if Scott was already planning for a future where Laci was not alive. Amber had no idea she was being lied to. She thought Scott was a charming, successful man who was looking for a serious relationship. December 24, 2002 changed everything. The night before, on December 23rd, Laci and Scott had gone to visit Laci's sister, Amy Rocha, at the salon where she worked. They arrived at around 5:45 in the evening. This would be one of the last confirmed times anyone saw Laci alive. The next morning, December 24th, was Christmas Eve. Scott's story about what happened that day was that Laci decided to take their dog for a walk in the neighborhood while he went fishing at the Berkeley Marina. He said he left the house around 9:30 in the morning to go fishing. He claimed he drove all the way to Berkeley, which is about 90 miles away from Modesto, to fish in the San Francisco Bay. Scott said he fished for a few hours and then drove home. When he arrived back at the house around 4:30 in the afternoon, he said Laci was gone. The dog was in the backyard with its leash still attached, which was strange because if Laci had taken the dog for a walk and come back, she would have taken the leash off. Scott called Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, and asked if she had heard from Laci. Sharon said no, and she immediately started to worry. Scott then called the police to report Laci missing. The police arrived quickly and began asking Scott questions about what had happened. Right away, things did not add up. Why would Scott drive 90 miles to go fishing in the San Francisco Bay on Christmas Eve? He was not known to be a fisherman. His friends and family said he had never talked about fishing before. Why would a woman who was 8 months pregnant and due to give birth in just a few weeks go for a walk alone in the middle of the day on Christmas Eve? Pregnant women in their 3rd trimester are usually uncomfortable and tired. It seemed unlikely that Laci would have wanted to walk around the neighborhood. And why did Scott seem so calm when he called the police? Most people whose spouse goes missing are frantic and emotional. But Scott's voice on the phone seemed flat and unemotional. These questions were just the beginning. The police started investigating immediately. They talked to neighbors. They searched the area around the Peterson home. They organized volunteer search parties. Hundreds of people showed up to help look for Laci. Her face was put on flyers that were posted all over Modesto and the surrounding areas. Laci's family was desperate to find her. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, appeared on television requesting information about her daughter's whereabouts. She expressed concern and asked for anyone who knew anything to come forward. And Scott also appeared in interviews, asking for help finding his wife. But to many people watching, something about Scott seemed off. He did not cry. He did not seem panicked. He spoke about Laci in a way that made some people uncomfortable. As the days went by, police became more and more suspicious of Scott. They started looking into his background and his behavior. They discovered that Scott had bought a fishing boat in early December 2002, just a few weeks before Laci disappeared. He had not told Laci about the boat. He had not told his family about it. He had not told his friends. It was a small aluminum boat, the kind you might use for fishing in a lake or a bay. Scott bought the boat from a store and paid cash for it. When police searched the boat, they found it had been recently cleaned. But they did find one strand of hair inside the boat that appeared to be similar to Laci's hair. This was a significant discovery because it suggested that Laci may have been in the boat at some point, even though Scott claimed she had never seen it. Police also discovered that Scott had been researching San Francisco Bay on his computer before Laci disappeared. He had looked up information about tides and currents. He had searched for details about what happens to objects when they are placed in water. He had also looked up information about saltwater fishing. This was very suspicious because Scott had told police he decided to go fishing on the morning of December 24th on a whim. But the computer searches showed that Scott had been planning the fishing trip in advance. Why would someone who is not a fisherman suddenly become so interested in the tides and currents of San Francisco Bay? And why would he research this information in the weeks leading up to his wife's disappearance? There were other strange details about Scott's behavior. On the day Laci disappeared, Scott told some people he had been golfing, not fishing. Later, he changed his story and said he had gone fishing. His story about what kind of fish he was trying to catch also kept changing. At first, he said he was fishing for sturgeon. Then he said he was not sure what he was trying to catch. When police asked him for details about the fishing trip, Scott could not provide many specifics. He could not clearly describe what kind of bait he had used or exactly where he had been in the bay. For someone who had supposedly just gone on a fishing trip, Scott seemed to have very little memory of what he had done. Scott's behavior in the days and weeks after Laci disappeared also raised red flags. He did not seem emotional enough for someone whose pregnant wife was missing. He appeared on television and gave interviews, but his demeanor was strange. He spoke about Laci in the past tense, as if she were already gone. He said things like, "Laci was a wonderful person," instead of, "Laci is a wonderful person." This made people, including investigators, wonder if Scott already knew that Laci was not coming back. Then, in early January 2003, something happened that destroyed whatever credibility Scott had left. The police got a phone call that would change the entire investigation. On December 30th, 2002, less than a week after Laci went missing, a woman named Amber Frey called the Modesto Police Department. She told them she had been dating Scott Peterson for over a month. She said Scott had lied to her and told her he was not married. Amber explained that she had no idea Scott had a wife, and she certainly did not know his wife was pregnant. Amber said that when she found out the truth about Scott, she was shocked and horrified. She immediately contacted the police because she wanted to help find Laci. Amber's phone call was a turning point in the case. It gave investigators a possible motive for why Scott might have wanted Laci to disappear. Maybe Scott wanted to be free from his marriage so he could be with Amber. Maybe he did not want the responsibility of being a father. The news about the affair became public in January 2003, and it turned into a national media story. Suddenly, everyone in America was talking about Scott Peterson. Here was a man whose pregnant wife was missing, and he had been having an affair. The public was outraged. People started to believe that Scott was guilty. The media covered the case constantly. News channels showed Scott's face over and over again. They analyzed his behavior. They talked to experts about what his body language might mean. The case became one of the biggest stories in the country. But Amber Frey did something that would become crucial to the prosecution's case against Scott. She agreed to work with the police. She agreed to continue talking to Scott on the phone, and she agreed to record all of their conversations. For weeks, Amber recorded every phone call she had with Scott. And in these recordings, Scott continued to lie. Even after Laci had been missing for weeks, even after the entire country was looking for her, Scott was still calling Amber and pretending to be single. He was still acting like nothing was wrong. He was still talking about a future together. In one of the most significant recorded calls, Scott told Amber he was in Paris celebrating New Year's Eve. He described being at the Eiffel Tower. He talked about the fireworks and the celebrations. But Scott was not in Paris. He was actually at a candlelight vigil for Laci in Modesto. While hundreds of people were gathered together, holding candles and hoping for Laci's safe return, Scott was standing among them and calling Amber to tell her lies. He called her from the vigil and pretended to be in another country. This recording would later be played in court, and it shocked everyone who heard it. How could someone whose wife was missing behave this way? How could he lie so easily and so often? The recordings also revealed Scott's personality. He was manipulative. He was charming. He knew how to say the right things to make Amber believe him. But the recordings also showed that Scott had no real emotion about Laci being missing. He never sounded worried. He never sounded scared. He talked about Laci in a detached way, as if she were just a problem that had been solved. These recordings became some of the most damaging evidence against Scott. Even though they were not direct proof that he had harmed Laci, they showed that Scott was a liar and that he was capable of manipulating people without feeling guilty. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. Police found out that Scott had a life insurance policy on Laci for $250,000. The policy had been purchased in June 2001, over a year before Laci disappeared and before she was pregnant. Scott also had a policy on himself for the same amount. The insurance agent who sold them the policies, a friend of the couple, later testified that it was actually Laci who wanted the higher amounts, and that the purchase was a normal financial planning decision. However, prosecutors still pointed to the policy as evidence of motive. If Laci was no longer alive, Scott would collect $250,000. Combined with the affair and all of Scott's lies, the existence of the life insurance policy became part of the overall picture prosecutors painted of a man who wanted to escape his marriage. In mid-April 2003, 4 months after Laci disappeared, the case took a tragic turn. On April 13, 2003, a couple walking their dog along the shore of San Francisco Bay near Richmond made a discovery. They found remains along the rocks. The next day, on April 14th, another discovery was made nearby. More remains were found in the same area. The remains were taken to the coroner's office, and DNA testing was done immediately. The results confirmed what everyone feared. The testing identified the remains as Connor Peterson and Laci Peterson. They had been in the water for approximately 4 months. The location where the remains were found was incredibly significant. They were discovered in the San Francisco Bay near an area called Richmond, very close to where Scott had claimed he went fishing on December 24, 2002, the day Laci disappeared. This was not a coincidence. If Scott had been fishing in that exact area on the day Laci went missing, and then the remains were found in that same area months later, it strongly suggested that Scott had placed Laci in the bay from his boat. The forensic examination results were significant for the investigation. Because of the time spent in the water, the coroner could not determine an exact cause of death. The condition of the remains reflected the extended time in the marine environment. There was evidence indicating that Laci had still been pregnant at the time of her death. This meant that Connor had not been born before Laci died. The remains had eventually separated while in the water, which is why they were found near each other, but not together. The forensic findings were presented as evidence, but many specific details were sealed by the court for the ongoing investigation. On April 18, 2003, just 4 days after the identification was confirmed, police arrested Scott Peterson. He was not at home when they found him. He was in the San Diego area, near the Mexican border, driving a car that belonged to his family. When police stopped him and arrested him, Scott looked completely different from the way he had looked in his previous television appearances. He had dyed his hair blonde. He had grown a goatee, and he had dyed that too. He looked like he was trying to disguise himself. When police searched the car, they found about $15,000 in cash. They found camping equipment. They found survival gear. They found 4 cell phones. They also found his brother's identification card. To investigators and to the public, it looked like Scott was trying to flee the country. Maybe he was planning to cross the border into Mexico and disappear. Scott was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, first-degree murder for Laci's death and second-degree murder for Connor's death. First-degree murder means the killing was planned in advance. Second-degree murder means the killing was intentional, but not necessarily premeditated. The reason Connor's charge was different was because prosecutors believed Scott had killed Laci and, as a result, Connor had also died. Scott pleaded not guilty to both charges. His family stood by him. His mother and his siblings gave interviews saying they believed Scott was innocent. They said the police had rushed to judgment and that Scott was being treated unfairly by the media. But most of the public believed Scott was guilty. The evidence against him seemed overwhelming. The affair, the lies, the computer searches, the fishing trip to the exact location where the remains were found, and his bizarre behavior after Laci disappeared all pointed to his guilt. The trial began in June 2004. It was one of the most highly publicized trials in American history. The trial was moved from Modesto to Redwood City in San Mateo County because it was impossible to find a jury in Modesto that had not already formed an opinion about the case. Everyone in Modesto knew about Laci Peterson. Everyone had an opinion about whether Scott was guilty. So the trial was moved to a different location to try to ensure a fair trial. The courtroom was packed every single day. News cameras recorded everything. Television networks provided live coverage. People across the country watched the trial unfold. The prosecution's case was led by Deputy District Attorney Rick DiStasso. The case against Scott was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no murder weapon. There was no crime scene. There were no eyewitnesses who saw Scott harm Laci. But prosecutors argued that the circumstantial evidence was so strong that it proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Scott was guilty. They presented evidence about Scott's affair with Amber Frey. They showed the jury the recorded phone calls where Scott lied over and over again. They presented evidence about the boat Scott had bought in secret. They showed that Scott had researched San Francisco Bay before Laci disappeared. They argued that Scott had killed Laci in their home sometime between the evening of December 23rd and the morning of December 24th. They said Scott had then put Laci in his truck, driven to the Berkeley Marina, loaded her onto his boat, and placed her in the bay. Prosecutors also presented testimony from Laci's family and friends. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, testified about her daughter. She talked about how excited Laci had been about the baby. She described Laci as a loving, caring person who would never have left her family voluntarily. Sharon also testified about Scott's behavior after Laci disappeared. She said Scott had seemed distant and cold. At one point during the trial, Sharon became very emotional in the courtroom. During the penalty phase of the trial, after Scott had been convicted, Sharon looked directly at Scott and said that divorce was always an option, but Scott had chosen a different path instead. Her words were powerful and heartbreaking. If you're as pulled into this case as I am, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next in this trial is going to shock you, and you don't want to miss a single detail here on Accused. The most powerful and damaging testimony at the trial came from Amber Frey. Amber took the stand and testified for 8 days. She told the jury about her relationship with Scott. She explained how Scott had lied to her from the very beginning. She talked about how Scott had told her he was single and that he had lost his wife. Amber came across as a credible witness. She was calm. She was honest. She admitted that she had been in a romantic relationship with Scott, but she made it clear that she had been deceived. Amber had not known Scott was married. She had not known Laci was pregnant. When Amber found out the truth, she immediately went to the police. The jury listened to hours and hours of recorded phone calls between Amber and Scott. These recordings were played in the courtroom for everyone to hear. In the calls, Scott talked about his feelings for Amber. He talked about wanting a future with her. He made plans to travel with her. He talked about mundane things like what he had for dinner and what the weather was like. But he almost never talked about Laci, and when he did mention Laci, he spoke about her in vague terms. He never sounded worried or upset that his wife was missing. The recordings painted a picture of a man who was completely detached from reality or who knew exactly what had happened to his wife because he had caused it. The defense was led by Mark Garagos, a well-known criminal defense attorney. Garagos argued that Scott was innocent and that the prosecution's case was weak. He said that all of the evidence against Scott was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof Scott had killed anyone. Garagos tried to suggest alternative theories about what might have happened to Laci. He pointed to a burglary that had occurred in the Petersons' neighborhood around the time Laci disappeared. He suggested that maybe Laci had witnessed the burglary and had been taken by the burglars. He tried to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline. He argued that there were witnesses who claimed to have seen Laci walking her dog in the neighborhood on the morning of December 24th, after Scott said he had left to go fishing. If these witnesses were correct, it would mean Laci was still alive after Scott left the house, which would suggest someone else had harmed her. But the defense struggled to explain away all of the evidence against Scott. They could not explain why Scott had been having an affair. They could not explain why Scott had lied so many times to so many people. They could not explain why Scott had researched San Francisco Bay before Laci disappeared. They could not explain why the remains were found exactly where Scott said he had been fishing. And they could not explain Scott's behavior after Laci disappeared, especially the fact that he had dyed his hair and was carrying $15,000 in cash when he was arrested. The defense tried to argue that Scott had dyed his hair because he was being followed by the media and wanted privacy. They said the cash was for everyday expenses. But these explanations did not convince the jury. After months of testimony, the case went to the jury. The jurors deliberated for 7 days. They reviewed the evidence. They listened to the recordings again. They discussed the timeline. They debated whether the circumstantial evidence was strong enough to convict Scott of murder. On November 12, 2004, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed. Laci's family was there. Scott's family was there. News cameras were everywhere. When the verdict was read, the jury foreman announced that Scott Peterson was guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson and guilty of second-degree murder for the death of Connor Peterson. The courtroom erupted. Laci's family reacted emotionally. Some of them embraced each other. Outside the courthouse, crowds of people who had been following the case responded when they heard the verdict. Scott showed no visible emotion. He did not cry. He did not react. He just sat there. His family was devastated. They could not believe the verdict. But most of the public felt that justice had been served. After the guilty verdict, the trial moved to the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Scott should be sentenced to death or to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The same jury heard testimony and arguments from both sides. In December 2004, the jury recommended that Scott be sentenced to death. The recommendation meant that the jury believed Scott's crimes were so serious and so cruel that he deserved the ultimate punishment. On March 16, 2005, Judge Alfred DeLucchi formally sentenced Scott Peterson to death. During the sentencing, Judge DeLucchi said that the murders of Laci and Connor were cruel, uncaring, heartless, and callous. He ordered Scott to pay $10,000 toward the cost of Laci's funeral. Scott was sent to San Quentin State Prison in California to await execution. At San Quentin, death row inmates are kept in separate cells and have very limited contact with other prisoners. Scott would spend the next 15 years on death row, but Scott did not give up. He continued to maintain his innocence. He filed multiple appeals challenging his conviction and his death sentence. Appeals in death penalty cases can take many years, sometimes decades. Scott's legal team argued that there had been errors during his trial. They said the jury had been biased. They said the media coverage had been so intense that it was impossible for Scott to get a fair trial. They argued that some of the evidence should not have been allowed in court. For years, these appeals moved slowly through the court system. Then, in August 2020, something unexpected happened. The California Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence. The court ruled that there had been problems with how the jury was selected. Specifically, the court said that some potential jurors who had expressed concerns about the death penalty had been removed from the jury pool in a way that was not fair or proper. The court said that these potential jurors should have been allowed to serve on the jury. This was a significant decision, but it was also important to note what the court did not do. The California Supreme Court did not overturn Scott's murder conviction. The court said that the evidence against Scott was strong and that his conviction should stand. They only overturned the death sentence. This meant that Scott would need to be resentenced. In December 2021, Scott appeared in court for a resentencing hearing. Laci's family was there. Sharon Rocha gave a powerful victim impact statement. She looked directly at Scott and told him that no matter what happened in the future, two things would never change. Laci and Connor would always be gone, and Scott would always be their killer. Her words were filled with pain and anger. After the hearing, Scott was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This meant Scott would spend the rest of his life in prison and would never be released. But even after being resentenced, Scott's case continued to make headlines. In January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced that they were taking on Scott's case. The Innocence Project is a nonprofit organization that works to free people who have been wrongly convicted of crimes. They use DNA testing and other methods to investigate cases where there may have been a miscarriage of justice. The fact that the Innocence Project was getting involved in Scott's case surprised many people. The Innocence Project said they believed there were questions about Scott's guilt that needed to be examined. They wanted to conduct new DNA testing on evidence from the case, particularly on a piece of material that was found with Laci when she was discovered. They wanted to see if the DNA on the material belonged to someone other than Scott or Laci. The Innocence Project also said they wanted to investigate the burglary that had occurred near the Peterson home. They believed there might be a connection between the burglary and Laci's disappearance. They also pointed to witnesses who claimed they had seen Laci alive on the morning of December 24th, after Scott said he had left the house. If these witnesses were correct, it would mean Laci was still alive after Scott went fishing, which would support the defense's theory that someone else killed Laci, the innocents. Project filed motions in court asking for permission to conduct new DNA testing and to review evidence that had not been fully examined during the original trial. Laci's family was not happy about the Innocence Project's involvement. Sharon Rocha and other members of Laci's family spoke out publicly, saying they were confident that Scott was guilty and that the Innocence Project was wrong to take on his case. They said that Scott had been given a fair trial and that the evidence against him was overwhelming. They expressed frustration that more than 20 years after Laci and Connor were killed, they still had to fight to keep Scott in prison. They said they felt like they were being forced to relive the trauma of losing Laci and Connor all over again. As of now, Scott Peterson is still in prison serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He is no longer on death row, but he will never be released from prison. His case remains in the legal system as the Innocence Project continues to push for new testing and a new trial. Whether Scott will ever be granted a new trial is unclear. The courts will have to decide whether the new evidence the Innocence Project wants to present is significant enough to overturn his conviction. But even if Scott is never granted a new trial, his case will likely continue to be debated for years to come. The Scott Peterson case became one of the most talked about murder cases in American history for several reasons. It had all the elements of a story that people could not look away from. There was a woman whose life was full of promise. There was a seemingly perfect marriage that was hiding terrible secrets. There was an affair. There was a husband who lied constantly and showed almost no emotion when his wife disappeared. There was a mystery about what really happened on Christmas Eve, 2002, and there was a trial that captured the nation's attention for months. The case also raised important questions about how we judge people accused of crimes. Scott's behavior was undeniably suspicious. He lied, he had an affair. He acted strangely after Laci disappeared. But was his behavior proof that he was a murderer? The jury thought so. They believed that the circumstantial evidence was strong enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Scott had killed Laci and Connor. But even now, more than 20 years later, there are people who question whether Scott received a fair trial. They point to the intense media coverage and the public's reaction to Scott as reasons why he may not have been judged fairly. They ask whether it is possible to convict someone of murder without direct physical evidence, without a murder weapon, without a crime scene, and without any eyewitnesses. One of the hardest parts of this case to understand is the question of why. If Scott did kill Laci, why would he do it? Prosecutors argued that Scott wanted to be free. He wanted to be with Amber Frey. He did not want the responsibility of being a father. He did not want to be tied down to a marriage anymore. But taking the life of your pregnant wife is an extreme and horrifying act. It is hard to understand how someone could make that choice. Some experts who have studied the case have pointed to Scott's personality. Throughout the trial and in interviews, Scott often seemed emotionally flat. He did not cry. He did not seem desperate or panicked. He did not show the kind of emotion that most people would expect from someone whose wife and unborn child were missing. Some people saw this as a sign of guilt. They believed Scott was not emotional because he already knew what had happened to Laci. He knew she was gone because he had caused it. Other experts have suggested that Scott may have a personality disorder that makes it difficult for him to express emotion in the way most people do. They point to traits like narcissism, a sense of entitlement, and a lack of empathy. These are traits that are sometimes seen in people who commit family violence. Scott may have seen Laci and Connor as obstacles to the life he wanted. He may have felt that removing them was the easiest solution to his problems. This kind of thinking is deeply disturbing, but it is not uncommon in cases where a spouse harms their partner. Experts call these types of killers family annihilators. These are people who harm their spouse and sometimes their children because they see their family as a burden or as something standing in the way of the life they want. The Scott Peterson case also highlighted how dangerous pregnancy can be for some women. Many people do not realize that homicide is one of the leading causes of death for pregnant women in the United States. According to studies, pregnant women are more likely to be harmed by a partner or ex-partner than by anyone else. This is a shocking and tragic statistic. Pregnancy is supposed to be a time of joy and anticipation, but for some women, it becomes a time of danger. Laci's story is a heartbreaking reminder that domestic violence and intimate partner violence are serious problems that affect women from all walks of life. Laci came from a loving family. She seemed happy. She had no obvious signs that she was in danger. But behind closed doors, her husband was living a secret life and planning to be with another woman. For Laci's family, the pain has never gone away. Sharon Rocha wrote a book about her daughter called For Laci, a mother's story of love, loss, and justice. In the book, Sharon talks about the grief of losing her daughter and her grandson. She talks about the anger she felt when she learned about Scott's affair. She talks about the long process of the trial and how difficult it was to sit in the courtroom and hear the details of what happened to Laci and Connor. Sharon has become an advocate for victims of crime. She has spoken out about the need for better protections for pregnant women and for better support for families who have lost loved ones to violence. Laci's case also had a broader impact on the legal system. In 2004, shortly after Scott was convicted, Congress passed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. This law recognizes an unborn child as a victim of certain federal crimes. The law is sometimes called Laci and Connor's Law because it was inspired by their deaths. The law states that if someone injures or kills a pregnant woman and causes harm to her unborn child, they can be charged with a separate crime for harming the child. This law has been controversial. Supporters say it is an important protection for unborn children and recognizes the value of their lives. Critics say the law could be used to undermine abortion rights by legally recognizing a fetus as a person. Regardless of the controversy, the law is a lasting part of Laci and Connor's legacy. The Scott Peterson case is a story about lies, betrayal, loss, and the search for justice. It is a story that continues to haunt everyone who followed it. Whether you believe Scott is guilty or whether you think there are still unanswered questions, one thing is absolutely certain. Laci and Connor Peterson deserved better. They deserved a life that was stolen from them. Laci deserved to meet her son. Connor deserved to be born and to grow up. They deserved to have a future. And their story is a reminder to all of us to pay attention to the people we love, to take warning signs seriously, and to never ignore our instincts when something feels wrong. The case is also a reminder of how complicated the justice system can be. Scott Peterson was convicted based on circumstantial evidence. There was no smoking gun. There was no confession. There was no physical evidence that directly tied Scott to the act of killing Laci. But the jury looked at all of the pieces of evidence together and decided that they added up to proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They believed that Scott's lies, his affair, his behavior, his computer searches, and the location where the remains were found all pointed to one conclusion. Scott killed Laci and Connor. For most people, that conclusion makes sense. But the fact that the Innocence Project is now involved in the case shows that not everyone is convinced. The legal battle may continue for years.